Hello and welcome back to the Durgama Peninsula. This will be the final battle report for week 1, and we're once again playing highly classified, this time against Nomads. You might recognize these models from an earlier battle report this week where we played Rescue and my opponent returned for a game of highly classified. Before we get into the lists, let me just show you the classifieds that we drew for this game. So the public classifieds were HVT espionage requiring a hacker, nano espionage requiring you to go and get fucked, requiring you to move a doctor or engineer into base contact with a conscious enemy specialist, get stabbed and try and make a whip roll, HVT kidnapping, which just requires a veteran elite or chain of command, and follow-up, which requires medium or heavy infantry. With these on the table, I then drew a selection of 2 private classifieds and picked identity check, which requires multispectral visors. Now, this presented me with an interesting opportunity and also kind of highlighted what I would call one of the problems with highly classified. The opportunity I had here was heavy infantry are in my firefight list because I like heavy infantry and they're good at fighting, and multispectral visors are in my firefight list because they're good for fighting, and hackers are in my firefight list because they're good for fighting. Which means that this objective set that I have could be fairly easily accomplished by a list built to actually step on my opponent's neck. This is something that highly classified will occasionally throw up, whereas countermeasures won't necessarily. You can see the cards in highly classified before you select your lists, and in this case I had 2 lists. I had a highly classified list and a firefight list, and I was able to pick my firefight list as a result. By comparison, in a game like countermeasures, you can't know what will be in play until you draw it each turn, so you have to build lists that can cover multiple bases without having to focus on covering every single base. It's a different dynamic, and I think countermeasures captures what you want from a mission about doing classifieds a little bit better than the current version of highly classified does, which can sometimes just be firefight or frontline with extra steps. Those missions are actually more complicated some of the time in the current ITS pack because they still have almost as many classifieds as highly classified, but require you to do other things as well. I have some thoughts on that, which I'll cover at the end of the report, but for now, this is what I had, and the opportunity it gave me was to play this list. So this is my current Haqqislam firefight just-esque list. It's built to be hack with big guns. I've been missing including the Azrael in lists. I really like that model. It's fun to play, it's big, it's chonky, it's a huge cannon, and there are really just a selection of other pieces in here that I like as well. There are the 4 bikes I've been including recently. It is still led by Saladin. It still has 2 Hassassin Bereeds because that's a great hacking package for a cheap cost. And it has the Mukhtar with MSV2 and Asawira Doctor duo that I've also been liking to use recently. As a bit of a nod to being Haqqislam as well, it also has a Ghulam Doctor with Nazmat in the second combat group. She is there explicitly to hang out with the Azrael and Nauf in high places, while the Asawira can hang out with the Mukhtar. So there's a lot of low-cost Doctor coverage, but I suspect if I wanted to, I could exchange the Ghulam for something else. For example, I could turn the Libertos into a non-mine layer profile, and the Ghulam with Nazmat could become a guided missile remote. That would be a totally reasonable change. This list in firefight is slightly risky to run specifically where there are specialist kills on the line, but as long as you are reasonably cautious with your Bereeds in particular, you aren't exposing too much to risk. The Asawira is the only specialist that's likely to be heavily exposed, and it has regeneration and is a linked, impetuous, it's a powerful heavy infantry. So overall, this is a list I wanted to play for a while. I had expected to be able to play it sometime next week, but with the classified flop that drops, I got to play it this week. This would be kind of a bad thing for my opponent because he had brought along a list that was actually specifically designed to cover loads and loads of classified bases. This is his list here. So here we can see a Nomad list that's stretching itself to cover many bases, and what it's doing is it's giving up not all but a fair bit of gunfighting in the process. The 2 notable gunfighting pieces would be the Evader with AP Spitfire, which really is just a BS-13 AP Spitfire, although it is, reasonably tolerant of failure, being an effective 2-wound HI, and then the Reverend Moira NCO. I actually really like the Moira heavy machine gun. It can spend, in this scenario, 2 lieutenant orders. to take speculative shots. It's only BS12, but Mimetism -6 forgives a multitude of sins. It's not by itself a gunfighting presence, though. It's more of a back pocket gunfighter to spend orders in Group 2 kind of usefully. The rest of the list is classic Nomad stuff. Zoe and Pywell, Jazz and Billy. There is a Tomcat Doctor with Zondcat. These are kind of classic, very good at doing highly classified pieces. Zoe and Pywell especially. I actually really like Zoe and Pywell for general use, but I would not call them an auto-include because nothing that costs 44 points is an auto-include. They have to be considered quite judiciously. In a normal Nomad list, they are most useful when you need a 0 SWC hacker. Of note on the SWC front, because this is a Cassandra Kusanagi list, it's packing a full 7 SWC, which is pretty cool, but it's all being spent mostly on a couple of 1.5 SWC gunfighters, a Libertos, and then those half an SWC Nomad luxury pieces that let you, bring your Morans, bring your etc. There's a lot of individual pieces going on in this list that I kind of like, but I do fundamentally think that what it's trying to do is spread itself very, very thin and do a few things that are cute, and especially the cost of Cassandra Kusanagi at 40 points eats into the meat and potatoes of this list. If you could afford some puppet bots or a Vostok or something like that, the list would be in a much better shape to absorb bad luck, push through problems, and play through even highly classified, which is kind of, in this case, a very simple mission to do. We rolled off Whip 14 versus Whip 16 lieutenants. I won the roll. I picked first turn. I have a Fidei in this list, plus loads of bikers. I've been going second a whole bunch so far. I wanted to try going first, and this is basically where things began to go wrong for my opponent. So here's the table. This is a blurry picture. The store was losing a bit of light at this point as the sun was setting. There'll be some better ones in the next couple of shots. But we can see my deployment here. The 16-inch deployment has actually given me just access to this high ground here, which probably was a mistake for my opponent to give me that deployment. But I've deployed Nauf up there with the helper bot from the Doctor. The Doctor herself is hanging out next to the Azrael. My HVT, there were really not a lot of good HVTs on this side. My opponent picked the side that he was on because it had much better places to hide HVTs. And so I've just put her up against the table edge. I don't worry too much about the fact that she is in plain view of my opponent. There is one classified that matters for, which is follow-up, where you need to be in zone of control and line of sight. And if my opponent has drawn telemetry to forward observe the HVT, well, there's really nothing I can do about that. I have it watched by this little turret on the high ground, and then Saladin is hanging out back here. This is not a perfectly safe position. It'll be a little bit vulnerable to something like a Tomcat if it turns up and climbs over the building, but it extends his repeater area out to cover the HVT and felt kind of worthwhile. We had a Barid deployed back here. The Mukhtar and the Asawira are deployed there, and then there's bikes here, 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 and then Zolekia, which you can see. Every bike except Zolekia is deployed impetuous. And this puts my opponent borderline on tilt quickly. The threat of those bikes moving rapidly from a staged position to his deployment zone presents him with a borderline existential threat that is really challenging for him to deploy against. My reserve drops are going to be a Hassassin, Barid, KHD, and Nauf. The Barid is the reserve drop purely because I need to HVT espionage early in the game before I lose both hackers, which is a risk, and then the Fidei because it's the Fidei. My opponent's deployment is not confused, but it's spread very thin as a result. He has to spread things out to avoid bike assaults taking him down. He tries to put up some hard AROs, but the hard AROs are in positions where they can then be engaged by my gunfighters. So for example, to stop this biker here, he puts an Evader Spitfire down, it's not quite in this position, but you can broadly see where it will be soon, which is going to end up being just about in line of fire of the Azrael from the word go. Contesting the impetuous bike assault along all of these lines, and also defending against my active gunfighters, and also defending against the threat of Fidei is basically going to prove to be a bit much to my opponent. He's null deployed in some cases, hard arrows in others, but I'm going to come at him pretty hard and pretty fast. this is a better shot of his deployment, and you can see some of what I'm talking about here. This is not the worst managed defense by any stretch of the imagination. The only really unforced error is this evader, which is trying to lock down this space here and here from bikers. There's a the flash pulse remote looking at the same thing. And then we've got sort of this mix of skirmishers and Morans, etc., trying to hold things back. But really, he's pushing against the tide. The biggest chink in his defenses is that the guided missile remote is deployed here, and Jazz is deployed here, and so I reserve drop my Haqqislam Fidei down right there. Now, I don't have a lieutenant to go for, because I haven't seen a Whip 14 model on the table apart from the Reverend Moira, which I strongly suspect to not be his lieutenant. I'm not even sure if it can be. And also, I know, because I've been speaking to him, that Cassandra Kusanagi is something he wants to try out. So there's no LT for me to charge in against, but I'm playing against Nomads and eliminating a guided missile remote and potentially Jazz into the process, who is the only white noise generator in his list, is going to potentially pay dividends. He tries to stall me out a little bit by deploying Cassandra watching this line, which is going to stop me from doing more. Basically, it's triage. The Haqqislam Fidei will potentially get some kills, but it will only get some kills. It's not going to be able to emerge, for example, and walk around and stab the evader or go after Zoe, because Cassandra is well positioned to fend it off. So it always sucks to have to triage your deployment like that to accept, say, 2 casualties in this case. He really should have reserve dropped the Libertos, but he was busy setting the Libertos up in a very forward position to try and hold Mouth back. So the cost, basically, or the benefit in my case of having a list that basically was a firefight list, being able to really aggressively deploy to attack very hard out the gate, was that this highly classified Nomad list just didn't have a position. It was stretched thin, trying to defend against everything, and had to make sacrifices. So because it's a clearer picture, I'm going to snap forward now to this picture here, which was taken at the end of the first round. But what has happened is I have launched an assault on all fronts. At the back here, the Fidei has moved around. It's taken a few orders. It's gotten a little bit unlucky, but it's managed to eliminate Jazz and the Vertigo Zond and then re-enter impersonation state. The Azrael has stood up, vaulted onto the railing and back, and eliminated the Evader. And then the bikes have YOLO'd forward. I took one face-to-face roll against a Morlock with a shotgun at long range. It was inconclusive. I didn't have any more orders to spend. And the bike that was previously deployed here has yeeted up and killed a Moran. So I'm peeling off the front line. I've killed, this is like 4 models that have been killed. And then I go and do a whole bunch of classifieds. I also take out his Libertos. The Azrael is able to discover and shoot the Libertos and kill it. So the bulk of the work that's done this turn in classified land is the Haqqislam Barid Killer Hacker that I had reserved dropped to make sure that I would have a hacker near, or hopefully near, wherever his HVT was. His HVT went down behind this crate here, so I just deployed the Barid on the steps, moved up, first order, successfully accomplishes HVT espionage, and then the duo with the Mukhtar and the Asawira moves out under smoke that has been laid by an impetuous biker, gets the Mukhtar in line of fire of the enemy HVT, and successfully does my private classified, which is using MSV against an enemy HVT. It's then very easy for the Asawira to do follow-up. It's in zone of control of the enemy HVT with 14. Again, passes, I think, on the second try. And then the Mukhtar pulls back. Now, the Mukhtar has been spotlit. There's a Moran hanging out on that building watching over the HVT, but it was in smoke the entire time. It was in no danger. And because the Vertigo Zond has been eliminated, I don't have to waste orders resetting. It would be nice to clear off that targeted, but I can focus on doing classifieds as well. So if you look at what this turn has accomplished, I've killed 5 enemy models out of 15. I've lost 1 biker. I've gotten some things targeted, but the enemy Vertigo Zond is dead. It's been coup de grace even to completely prevent any chance of an engineer fixing it up. And I've done 3 classifieds. The wind is basically really heavily out of my opponent's sails at this point. He has what I would call basically the best turn that he can, and there are some good plays here. So when the biker rolled around here to try and deal with the Flash Pulse remote, we actually had a very cute 1-inch prone dodge from the Moira. That prone dodge pushed her into line of fire of just my turret, so when she activated then she could crawl back forward towards the railing and take the turret out. She could then stand up in cover, so this is like really nicely, smoothly executed, and begin moving around here, engaging the Azrael, which it took multiple face-to-face rolls, but it's not an arrow piece. It had to rely on its armor to get by, and in about 3 orders, she suppressed it. And at that point, I'm like, you know what? I've taken a wound. You want it more. I drop prone, and that lets the Moira move down and along these stairs, and you can see her hanging out there now. And she's moved up and back and done follow-up, as she's being a medium infantry in zone of control and line of fire of my HVT, and she passes her whip roll on a 14, which Moiras have. This is a really good use of the second combat group, and actually is a real case for why Reverend Moira HMGs in Group 2 as back pocket gunfighters can just be really cool. She killed some things, she suppressed some things, she accomplished an objective, and her access to the lieutenant orders adds that like group flexibility that's really nice. The first combat group, which had been most heavily gutted, would not fare so well, and mostly orders were spent moving things forward. And Cassandra Kusanagi herself coming up, trying to deal with this Kum Rider here that was at a position to up on its flank. Now it ends up successfully dropping smoke, and she engages the Mukta, but the range bands are bad. It all just kind of goes horribly wrong, and she doesn't particularly accomplish anything. Early in my second turn, she's going to die to active turn gunfighting. Actually, she might even have been killed by the Kum Rider, which is going to put my opponent in loss of lieutenant on his second turn. And we play out my second turn, but we collectively agree that there's not a great deal more to be done. By the end of this turn, I'll have effectively accomplished every objective, which we'll get to in a moment. And it's a one-sided shellacking, and my opponent calls it there. The only thing that's really worth covering in terms of how the rest of this turn played is just to once again express my absolute hatred of the nano-espionage classified, but just to show you how I accomplished it. Some smoke got placed down here so that the Asawira could jump up onto this crate and begin moving his way across this bridge. The Mukta moved around as well to clear off the turret and to bait out AROs, and the Asawira moved up to here, and then popped into close combat with the Moran. Unfortunately, this was a combi rifle Moran, which is to say it had D charges. So I had to make a normal roll against him, and he had to make a normal roll against me, and I failed my whip roll, and he passed his CC roll, and so I took 3 armor-piercing damage 14 hits. The Asawira actually survived on 1 wound, girded its loins, and did it again. The Moran hit a second time with a second D-charge and absolutely blew the Asawira up, but the Asawira did accomplish this objective. There's really no case whatsoever for objectives to be this difficult to do, like requiring you to actually sacrifice a piece. So the nano-espionage classified can die in a fire, but I can at least say I did it. I used a doctor, I got it into close combat, I did the damn thing, and that put me on 10 objective points to my opponent's 1, and we functionally called the game there. This is only 3 turns in, but he would be in loss of lieutenant on his second turn. He was down basically all of his specialists. Pywell was dead, Zoe was dead, both Morans were dead, Jazz was dead, Kusanagi was dead. The number of actual classifieds he could do, I don't know what was in his hand, but there was basically nothing left that he could accomplish. All of his hackers were gone, so he couldn't do HVT espionage. He didn't have, his engineer was dead, so he couldn't do nano espionage. It was an unrecoverable situation, and we called it there. So this sort of concludes formally my Durgama Takeover Week 1 missions. I've played quite enough highly classified. It was a very interesting experience to really drill down into a mission like this and play it over and over. I think I would almost recommend it as a practice approach if you're comfortable with that, do the same thing over and over, giving up some novelty. I did find that playing the same scenario multiple times in a row opened up some sort of like insights into play patterns. But especially doing battle reports for the damn thing has gotten at least a little bit. I have lost the novelty of talking about the scenario. So I'm glad to be finished with highly classified. Week 1 Durgama is not over yet, but it will be quite soon, and we'll move on to some new missions in the next week. Just to wrap the battle report up, what do I think highly classified should be changed to kind of regain its role as the complicated classified-based scenario alongside countermeasures? Having thought about it a little bit, I actually think you should just add some more classifieds to it. Right now, there are a ton of points associated with doing more than your opponent, but there are only 5 classifieds that can be done per person per side. In countermeasures, you will often see games where 6 or even 7 or 8 or sometimes 9 classifieds are done by a player. It's very hard to do 9, but it is possible. And there's no reason why highly classified can't have almost that many as part of its flop. I would like to see it move, for example, to maybe 5 public classifieds and 2 private, and then you can have 1 point for doing more than your opponent. Or maybe 1 private classified and then 6 or 7 public ones. That will really force players to have highly classified lists. And frankly, highly classified with 5 classifieds, like I said at the beginning, is not really any more complicated than a scenario like Frontline, which has, I want to say, 4 classifieds, but then that whole end of game scoring of zones. So if people would like to try out a variant highly classified, we can call it really highly classified, where there are maybe 5 or 6 or 7 classifieds to do. Or even potentially you could do a game called extremely highly classified, where, hell, just put 20 cards out, just put every classified objective on the table and see who can do the most in the game. That could genuinely be a slightly crazy, but potentially really interesting scenario. I think I will try that maybe in a meme event at some point. I would be surprised if it wasn't at least a little bit playable. Anyway, that concludes Durgama Takeover Week 1. There'll be a link in the description and in the comments to the battle report on the Durgama table, on the Durgama page. And that battle report will have some pictures that weren't shown in this battle report, along with potentially a bonus meme. So I hope you've enjoyed this. This concludes Durgama Takeover Week 1, and I'll join you again soon for Durgama Takeover Week 2.